Spoiler alert. I'll try not to be too specific with the spoilers, but you've been warned. Terranigma. In Japan it was called Tenchi Sozo, which translates as the creation of heaven and earth. It was made by Quintet, who'd previously made ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, and Illusion of Gaia. Terranigma was basically the swan song for the Super Nintendo. In the PAL regions it came out just a couple of months before the Nintendo 64 hit, and there weren't really any big 16-bit games that followed it. I didn't realise it until much later, but Terranigma was never released in America. Perhaps because the 64 was already out there and no one would have noticed an obscure 16-bit RPG in the eye-popping brilliance of Super Mario 64. Wikipedia claims that by the time it was due for localization, Enix had already shut down its American base. Terranigma is a vast, epic, and grand role-playing game starring a single main character who is given the simple task of resurrecting the entire planet. Knowing this, it's amazing how simple, tame, and predictable the game is in its beginnings. You play as this cheeky little youth called Ark, who's constantly getting in trouble by the people of his village for pulling pranks. He lives in a town called Krista, which is entirely self-contained. No way in, no way out. It's a merry little place, but something seems slightly off, almost like it's a dream or something. Anyway, everything goes bad when Ark is convinced by his friends to break down a door that they're not supposed to use. The friends all chicken out, leaving Ark to venture down to the dungeon and find a strange glowing box. He unlocks the seal on the box and meets a funny little character called Yomi, who can pull Ark into the box. This is effectively the menu screen. But then Ark has to face up to the consequences of his actions. With Pandora's box no longer sealed, all of Krista's residents turn to stone, including Ark's girlfriend, Elle. The angry elder sends Ark outside of the village to find a way to return the people to normal. Right, so far so cliché, but when you exit to the world map you begin to realise that this isn't a normal kind of world that Ark's living in. Where exactly is this? Turns out this is the planet's underside, the interior. Trippy. For the first couple of hours you'd be forgiven for thinking that this game is not really very different from the 1,000 other RPGs you've played. But then, after beating the first 5 dungeons and resurrecting continents, hooray, Australia, Ark is given an ever so slightly enormous task by the Elder. Go to the outer surface of the planet and resurrect life. Sure, he's managed to raise the continents from the bottom of the ocean, but everything's dead and volcanic up there. Ark's mission is to see that plants, birds, animals, and people populate the planet and advance once more. Once Ark goes topside, he finds himself living outside of the normal confines of time. He's a human, and yet he's somehow not. It's a really weird and fascinating story. I originally had in my mind that Ark was the bringer of life millions of years ago when the Earth was still forming, but I don't think I really understood it properly. The characters speak of how life used to exist on the planet, but it was wiped away. In that sense, the Japanese title isn't entirely accurate. This isn't about the creation of heaven and earth, it's about resurrection. So I suppose this is set in some distant future then? It's never really explained why all life on Earth ceased to exist, but it's Ark's mission to make sure it returns. I've got to say, this would make a wonderful anime series. It was a 2-volume manga in Japan apparently, but as far as I know that's never been localised. The graphics in the game range from very nice to a bit repetitive and dull. It's nowhere near the artistic grandeur of Seiken Densetsu 3, but it's definitely a step up from Illusion of Gaia. It's also got a truly wonderful soundtrack with some really beautiful tunes. It's a shame it's never been orchestrated. You know, just this week I went to see the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra play video game music. Most of it was from modern games, but I was very impressed they played a track from Seiken Densetsu 3. If they played Terranigma music, I may have started screaming. Probably a good thing they didn't. Anyway, back to the game. Ark's weapon of choice is a spear. It's not a particularly deep combat system, but it works. It's very much a hack and slash real-time system like Zelda, and once you figure out a couple of good combo moves, you'll be mowing down the enemies in no time. Once all of the life has been resurrected, the game becomes more of a traditional RPG with lots of fetch quests and trade between towns. It's really cool that your actions can actually have a tangible effect on whether a town will grow and expand or stay small and insignificant. It's up to Ark to encourage the residents to build industries, establish trade routes and assist the needy. And in his travels he helps to invent the light bulb, the telephone, and even the aeroplane. When Ark enters into the dungeon type areas, there's a map that he can look at, but it's not very intuitive. In fact, it's not that helpful at all, and I really didn't use it. Speaking of unhelpful, Ark does gain the ability to use magic spells, but I never really used them either, and here's why. Throughout your journey, you pick up these blue crystals called Magirocks, and they're basically your currency for buying magic spells. Only problem is, once you use a Magirock, it's gone, so there's only so many spells that you can buy before you've run out of currency for the whole game. My conservative side just didn't want to waste any spells and just kept them all sitting in the box. While Ark himself is a fairly light-hearted and cheeky character, the themes of Terranigma are deep and sometimes not always easy. At one point, Ark gets trapped by an avalanche and finds himself in a cave with a mountain goat and her dead husband. Will Ark eat the dead goat to survive? Another creepy moment is when Ark finds a strange but pleasant little town in the middle of the desert. The people are very friendly and they offer him a free bed. But when he wakes up the next morning, the beautiful town is now a ruin and all of the people are the walking dead. Turns out the whole town was just a mirage. The real town was destroyed by monsters years ago and this is all that remains. Creepy, man. Thanks to the space limitations of the cartridge, most of the towns look pretty much the same, even though they're on completely different continents. I know this is fairly usual for old RPGs, but it would have been awesome if the Americans had at least used different tiles to the Spaniards, for example. It is a bit weird to be in such a fantasy-style RPG and yet visiting real places, like Australia. Let's see, my home's just around here somewhere. Aha! Yep, it looks just like this. Oh look, there's koalas up the palm trees, just like in real life. Hey, check this out. When you visit the city of Neo Tokyo, there's some flashing neon signs. Now, my katakana isn't brilliant, but what I read didn't really make much sense to me. First it says Enix News, got that. Then it seems to say Dorafue 6. Is that maybe a code for Dragon Quest VI? Or have I just read it completely wrong? What's next? Kinji Tsuhatsupai. Doesn't make any sense to me. Can anyone figure it out better? I think it's supposed to be an ad for Dragon Quest VI. Not sure. Terranigma is not a really long game. I absolutely rushed through it this year and I finished it in about 12 hours. I would not recommend playing it this way though. It's much better when you can just take it at your own pace. Now, I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I'm man enough to admit that the first time I played this game, it brought me to tears. Only 2 games have ever done that, and this was one of them. Perhaps I was just being an emotional teenager at the time, I don't know, it's possible. But the last part of the game really has some sting. I felt a huge sense of betrayal, of sadness, and of loneliness. I think that's one of the main lingering feelings with this game. By the end, Ark doesn't really fit in anywhere. He's got nowhere to really belong and he wonders if all of his hard work was for nothing. I just found this incredibly sad back in '96. In 2012, not so much, but it's still one of the most heavily themed games I've ever played. It's hardly the usual light fluff that you find in a video game story. The translation is decent, for a change, and it's all well written. Walking in the footsteps of Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia, Terranigma absolutely leaves them in the dust, with its scale, its emotion, and its ambition. It's definitely up there as one of the Super Nintendo's greatest role-playing games, and I've got to say, it's still extremely enjoyable 16 years after its original release. It's just a wonderful game, and the last decent game that Quintet ever made. After this, they sunk further and further, ending with a horrible Godzilla game on Dreamcast. But as long as people are still playing their classics like Terranigma, they shan't be forgotten. Next week... there is no next week. That's it. The games have all been played. Oh well, join me next week anyway in one final episode for a recap and a farewell. I hope you've enjoyed the year of retro gaming as much as I have. Peace out.